Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learning Styles webinar. I'm Nicola. I've been teaching for 15 years and I've taught in South Africa and South America. I absolutely love teaching. It has been such a rewarding experience to see my students grow and also to grow as a teacher. It's truly a fascinating experience. So, welcome, everyone. This week's webinar is focused on the learning styles. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session where you can post any questions you have about the different learning styles. If you have any other questions regarding another topic, feel free to send a ticket to tutor support. Okay, so before we get started, let's have a look at who's joining us today. I already see one person. Hello from Greece. Hello and welcome. And hello from Cape Town, South Africa. Welcome, welcome. We have a student from Senegal. Welcome. And hello, Lawrence. Welcome. Anybody else wants to say hi? Let us know where you're from. We have Julie from London. Welcome. We also have a student from Milan, Italy. Welcome, welcome. We have Wendy from Greenway. Oh, Wendy Greenway from UK. Hi, hi. And Catherine from Belgium. We have Chantel from South Africa. Hello. And Happy Dog English. Welcome. We also have another student from France, Leonie. And we also have another student from Oklahoma, Carson. Wow, welcome everyone. Lawrence from UK as well. That's fantastic. Fantastic to see you all here today. This is, oh, we have some more. Esther from Toronto. Hi. And Persa from Greece. Welcome. Hello, everyone. Fantastic to see you all here. So today's webinar is very, very interesting. We are looking at the different learning styles, and we're also going to be looking at how we can incorporate those into our classrooms. So let's get started. We are looking at how our learners process, how they understand, express, and retain information. Side of teaching. So, how do you think you would learn a new language? Maybe you've had the experience and you can reflect on that. Think about your experience in learning a language. Would you create mind maps or take notes? Would it be more effective for you to listen to the target language? Do you prefer to learn in groups or to learn alone? I remember my brother used to talk incessantly when he was trying to learn a language. He would talk to himself. So everyone has their own ways. The other question is, do you prefer to learn alone or do you prefer to learn in groups? Maybe you'd use a combination of all of these methods to remember and retain information. And also, maybe your study methods will change over time. So, what this is saying is that learning styles can also change over time. It's also unlikely that students will have a single learning style. Most of us use a combination. However, at times you might find there are predominant styles in some learners. The key is also getting to know your students. That's why it's also so important. So we're drawing on psychologist Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. According to this theory, the 7 learning styles are spatial or visual, which is learning through seeing, There is musical or auditory, which is learning through listening. There's also kinesthetic, which is learning by using the body and through real and tangible means. Other learning styles is verbal, which includes reading, writing, and words in general. You also have your logical or mathematical style, which is when learners retain information through logical analysis and structural study. And then, of course, interpersonal or social, which is learning with others. This is where group work and pair work is important. And then intrapersonal or solitary, which is self study, learning alone, which is another important element when learning a language. What's the key here? The key is that our lessons and our teaching methods should incorporate multiple learning styles. So all our students benefit and we can promote their learning adaptability. So we don't want our students just to use one learning style throughout their lives. No, we're here to help them open up and find ways of learning through different means. Combining the different learning styles in our lessons will also benefit students who have trouble with certain areas in English, such as understanding grammar or grasping a reading text, for example. Through the use of various stimuli, such as visuals, audio, working in groups, each learning style will help to strengthen our students' understanding, and also, the learning styles help us to elicit new language from our students. This webinar will look at the different learning styles while strengthening those elements that create a great lesson. So, if you haven't noticed yet, you will start to notice that all of these elements are things that we need to use in our lessons anyway, like listening and reading and writing and speaking. Let's begin with the visual or spatial learning style. So, this style benefits learning through pictures or written information. Many of our EFL students can struggle with listening in English. So, combining visuals when eliciting new language really benefits these students. To help your learners associate information visually, use pictures, images, posters, flashcards when you're presenting new items. You also can use videos and realia. And another good way is to provide grammar and vocabulary charts that are color coded. Use different colors on the board and underline or circle key information. So it really helps learners retain information visually. More specific activities that you could use are also Hangman or Pictionary. These involve words and visuals. It's great also to get your students to describe, label, or caption an image. Comic strip rewrites can also be fun. Okay, so that's the visual or spatial learning style. Next, we move on to the auditory or music learning style. And this helps students to acquire knowledge through listening and sound. How to integrate this style into your lessons? Include a variety of listening tasks, discussions, and pronunciation drills. Create grammar and vocabulary lessons around songs and videos. Encourage your students to watch films or series or listen to podcasts or audiobooks outside the classroom. And what's great about that is that you can incorporate your students' interests into this extra activity and extra listening. And that also motivates your students and helps them to really enjoy the language because they're learning about things that are interesting to them. For in the classroom, inside a lesson, more specific examples could be letting your students read texts aloud as well as silently. Also, listening memory games. You can always create memory games around your audios. Games like Jeopardy are a lot of fun and work really well with this. So, auditory or musical style listening. Next, we move on to kinesthetic learners, or at least kinesthetic learning methodologies. Learners who benefit kinesthetically from lessons retain information when they're physically engaged in tasks and they're participating actively in the content they're learning. So, to bring the style into your lessons, include some physical movements, moving around. A good way is also when you're pairing your students up, you can also have them change seating, changing the context a little bit. Using props and realia are always a good idea because they're bringing real life into the classroom. Kinesthetic learners really benefit from that. Also, presenting information through real life situations and practical examples helps these learners. Some other examples that you could use in your classrooms could be blocks, puzzles, board games and crafts, charades, show and tell. But keep in mind, these would be for younger learners. For adult learners, you could have them prepare presentations or they could participate in role plays and simulations because, again, you're bringing that real life into the classroom. Okay, kinesthetic. Let's move on to reading or writing, also called the verbal style. So, students here will process information in words, whether they are written or spoken. So the word aspect is really the key. If you want to assimilate this style into your lessons, you should include speaking activities as well as reading activities, written assignments, and tasks, anything to do with words. Other fun ways that you could incorporate this style into your lessons is through storytelling, category writing games, worksheets are also good for this, and journal writing, which students can do outside of the class, which again is good. We need to push our students a little bit to use the language outside of the classroom environment to help them build up their motivation and their confidence. So that's reading and writing. Next, let's have a look at logical or mathematical. This style will help students process information through analytical skills and systems. So, if you want to, well, actually, importantly, that you do assimilate the style into your classroom, try to break down language structures into tables and charts. Aim for your lessons to follow a logical structure that students can get used to and activities that will necessitate logical thinking and reasoning. This is generally very good for learning things like grammar and word formation, the, the systems part of English. Other specific activities that you can do in your lessons can include having students prepare for and present an argument for debates, because then again, is that analysis and logical thinking of preparing an argument. You can also include sequencing activities or problem solving tasks. So, tasks where students need to use their logical thinking skills. Moving on, let's look at the personal or social learning style. You'll find that a lot of your learners benefit from learning interpersonally and they retain information through more interpersonal activities. That would be learning in groups or pairs. A great way to include this style into your lessons would be through peer correction and peer teaching. Get students to correct each other, get them to help each other. Group or pair activities are always good, and you can also include some teamwork as well. And you also want to encourage an environment where your learners can feel free to speak. So they feel that they can be part of the group and take part of the group and participate. And you also, in general, want to include as much interaction between students as possible. In your lessons, this makes them a lot more fun, and the students get to learn a lot from each other. You can also do other types of specific activities, could be sharing stories and opinions, interviews, making sure your students are interacting, mystery games, negotiations, activities where students collaborate as a team. Learners also benefit a lot from the intrapersonal style, which is the process where they retain information through self study. This is an important part of the learning process because we need to process all the information. It takes time. So, sitting alone with the information can aid in that process. In your classroom, to bring the style in, let your students work alone at times during each lesson. And when applicable, you can delegate individual tasks to students working in groups. Again, you'll also get to know your students in the process and you'll see what kind of learning style they feel most comfortable with. But again, you do want to do a little bit of pushing in the right direction towards adapting to other learning styles. So, for very shy students, yes, of course, they'd love and prefer to work alone, but we do want to get them interacting a little bit. Homework is also important part of learning, and this is where we encourage self-study in our students. So, and just to go back, some other examples of some more specific activities you can do in your lessons are to give students individual research projects. They can also work on an English journal, and this will also keep their motivation up. So, what I'd really like you to take away from this webinar is the importance of incorporating a variety of learning styles into our lessons. We want to help promote inclusivity, which also helps motivation and learning in our lessons. So, we want all our students to feel that they're benefiting and that they're being thought of in the lesson. Maybe now you've noticed it's interesting that the different learning styles really do make for a fantastic lesson if you include all of them because they link to what's necessary when learning a language. So think about it, including visuals when you are presenting information or including listening tasks, reading and writing. This is also part of it, speaking, peer group, pair work, group work, individual work. All of this is part of a great ESL lesson. So, this brings us to the end of our presentation. I do hope that you found it useful. I hope that some of the information was able to resonate with you as well as a learner. If you think about yourself as a learner, this is also a good way. We want empathy for our students and to understand where they're coming from. That way, we can really help them. So, before we get to questions, think about your experience. How did you learn a language, or how do you think you'd learn a language? What style do you think you'd be most comfortable with? So, I am going to open up to questions. Anybody who has a question, please feel free to post it and we will start chatting. I'd also like to remind you just before is that all the webinars are on our YouTube channel in the video section. You can find them there. And before we start our Q&A session, I'd also just like to post the link for Survey Monkey. Let us know what you thought of the webinar. Okay, so I'm going to wait for a few questions here. Okay, thank you, Leonie. Let's have a look at your question. How not to get overwhelmed when trying to incorporate all these learning styles into the lesson? Great question. Thanks, Leonie. The key here is lesson planning. So when you are planning your lessons, take into account all the learning styles and take your time in the beginning. Don't worry if lesson planning takes a little bit of time. It will, and it will become faster as you continue practicing. But ask yourself as you're going through your lesson plan, do I have some listening? Do I have some visuals? Maybe the students can read a little bit of text. Maybe writing could be for their homework. That's why having that lesson plan as your foundation means that you can modify and change things, but without getting overwhelmed. So take your time in the beginning. And like I say, it will get much easier with time, and you will get used to incorporating all these different learning styles into your lessons. If you're using a course book, for example, a lot of schools want you to use a course book, and a lot of schools will also provide you with listening materials. So you'll see in the course book, there's always a listening section, there's a reading section, a writing section. A lot of the material is already made that way. And as you get more familiar with it, you'll get more used to it. But coming back to the question, not to get overwhelmed, take your time when planning your lessons. Okay, let's look at another question. Thank you so much, Valentina. So, what could be the most adequate style for very young students, 2 years old? Wow, very good question there, too. For 2-year-olds, I think that you need to use a lot of kinesthetic and, you know, tactile activities, because at that age, children are learning a lot through the environment. So that would be through certain sensations. But again, you could also use visuals to help your learners at 2, because they'll associate things like colors or feelings. Um, in terms of audio, you could use things like sound effects. So if you wanted to teach a 2-year-old, the sound, a pig, then the word pig, then you could use the sound of the pig, and a sheep and the sound of the sheep, for example. So again, try to incorporate all of them, but of course, it needs to be appropriate for the age. Okay, thanks, Valentina. Nice question. Let's go to Happy Dog English. Thanks for your question. If you're using a song to teach vocabulary, would you give the students the vocabulary list first or afterwards, or get them to write down what they can hear in the song? Thanks for the great question. It's always advisable to pre teach vocabulary first because you want to give your students a fair chance in going into this listening and being able to follow it. Sometimes students can feel very demotivated when you show them something and they didn't understand anything. And a lot of the time, students can hear one word that they didn't understand, and then their brain blocks to the rest of it. So, to avoid that, you want to pre teach vocabulary, also pre teach the setting, prepare your students for the activities that you're going to give them. So, in a way, it's like not throwing them into the deep end. Hey, thanks for that question. And let's have a look. Another question from Lawrence. How can I retain information after learning? Great question, Lawrence. The multiple learning styles here would benefit you. So they would benefit any learner. If you want to retain information, first you'll read it, you'll write it, first you hear it, then you actually say it. This is really the brain's way of processing information. If we think of a vocabulary, a new vocabulary item for students, first we'd introduce it probably through writing. They would see the word, then maybe they would write the word, then we would show them a listening. We'd use the word in conversation, and it would take time, but using all of those styles would be important for the brain's processing. And it would make things easier, in fact, to retain. Great question. Thank you, Lawrence. Okay, so next question. Hi, Allah. Thank you very much for joining us and thank you for your question. How to know what style your student uses? Okay, so it will take a little bit of time to get to know your students, but you will see some students might struggle with listening more than other students, or some students might not grasp reading as easier or as quicker as other students, and that can give you a clue. It's also important sometimes just to directly ask your students before you start your course, get to know them. You can always do a needs analysis, you can do interviews, and you could ask them, what are the biggest challenges for you in English? Is it listening? Is it reading? Is it writing? Do you prefer to study by taking notes or by listening? And you'll find that a lot of your students are, in fact, quite aware of their learning styles. So that would be my advice in getting to know your students' learning styles. Okay, next question. Christine, welcome. What learning style should I apply when teaching adults? Thank you so much for your question. So, the key here would be to use multiple learning styles for young learners and for adults. Think about the brain as almost like a machine that needs to process information, and it needs to do that by seeing it in all these different contexts. It's never a good idea to use one learning style in your lessons, even if it's for a private student who prefers to learn that way. You want to try and bring in all the learning styles so that you can help your students grow in their learning as well. They can adopt new styles and new techniques to retain information. So the answer there would be all the learning styles. Use all of them. Okay, let's have a look. Next question. Thanks so much, Catherine. Wouldn't it be better to include only a few learning styles in one lesson and change the learning styles in the next lesson so as not to overwhelm the students? Good question. It will depend on the level of your students. It will depend on the time of your lesson as well. But remember that you don't need to include large, large or let's say long material for each learning style. So even if you include a little bit of reading by writing a word on the board and your students read that word, that might have taken 1 or 2 seconds, wasn't too overwhelming, but you got reading in there. So if your class is focusing on, let's say, listening, then of course that's going to be the main style that you're using. But around that, try to add little things. Students could read the title, or students could read maybe a quote from the listening. Homework then could be writing, for example. Generally, when we're presenting vocabulary and information, that's where you're putting in your visuals. So the key is not to focus on every single learning style in a very, let's say, long way, for lack of better word, but throw little parts in. That would be the best way. But yes, you don't want to overwhelm your students, so keep activities short. You don't want to keep your activities longer than 20 minutes as well. Okay, and again, also use different learning styles in your homework activities. So if you didn't get to, let's say, reading, then you can give your students some reading for homework, and that could also throw it in there. Okay, thank you so much for the question, Catherine. Let's look at another question from Lawrence. How can I use the resource pack to answer questions in Unit 5 Assignment A? Okay, so Lawrence, for that question, since we're only focusing on the learning styles, you can contact tutor support and we'll help you with that. Okay, moving on to the next question, Catherine. Thanks so much. How exactly would you incorporate the interpersonal learning style into an online class if you want students to form groups? Since they're not sitting in a class, what would this look like online? Great question. A lot of our teaching now takes place online, and it is a question that needs to come up. The best way to do this is to use breakout rooms. Breakout rooms allow you to separate your students into groups, and the rest of the class can't hear what they're saying. So it's not overwhelming with the audio. That way, they get to work in groups. You, as the teacher, can go into the breakout rooms and give a little bit of a listen, but at least this is a technological tool that we can use to do that. So breakout rooms is always a good way. I hope that helped you, Catherine. And let's go to our next question. Okay. So thank you very much, Lawrence. Mentioned resources, materials on learning styles. Um, Again, for those extra resources, you can contact us on tutor support and we'll send you through some of those resources as well as where you can find them in the course. So all you need to do is contact tutor support. Okay, so we've had some fantastic, in fact, all of these questions have been so great and so interesting. Thanks very, very much. Still got time. So, any other questions that come to mind, post them. Think about learning styles. Maybe you could also share how you learn, what your experience has been. Did you find that you were a visual learner and has that changed? Any questions also that you might have related to young learners and adult learners with the different learning styles. Take your time, have a think. Okay, thank you. We have a question from Allah. Thank you very much. How many times you should review a new word for an average learner? Hmm, it is a good question, and it can differ with learners. If I'm thinking about an average learner, I would say that student would need to see the word a few times. Few times could be maybe 3 to 6. Hear the word the same amount, maybe write the word, use the word in speaking, maybe see it in accuracy based activities like worksheets as well. And with all of that, your student could retain that information. But we need to remember that we need to keep practicing that information. It's not something that we can do once off. If we teach a new word in one lesson, try and incorporate that word again into the next lessons as well to help your students along. So I would say a few times using all the different learning styles and information processing systems. Okay, so let's have a look, a comment from Leonie. So I'm not sure with your LS with confidence. So, Leonie, if you could clarify your question, that would be great. You can just pop us another one in the chat. And let's go in the meantime to another question from Esther. Thank you very much. How do you break up the groups online? So that's again, we'd be using breakout rooms. Breakout rooms allow you to break your students into groups or into pairs online, and you can go into each breakout room and hear. But the rest of the class can't hear what's going on. So, any kinds of platforms that you would use, for example, Zoom, Teams, these kinds of conferencing, video conferencing, does allow you to break up your students into groups in an online environment. So, thanks for that question, Esther. And let's go back to Lawrence. Lawrence, which learning style would you recommend for learners in intermediate level? So, here, depending, it doesn't really matter about the level or even the age. You would want to incorporate all of those learning styles into your lessons. Even if you're focusing for a little bit of time on reading, a little bit of time on writing, you want to incorporate all those styles into your lessons. So let's imagine for an intermediate level, you might be doing a listening class and you need to introduce new vocabulary to your students before they listen. You could do that with pictures. You could also write the words on the board. Students will then listen. After that, they'll see the word again in writing. You might ask them to do a discussion activity, then they'll use the word. They could do worksheets alone where they have to look at the vocabulary. So you'll see in any ESL classroom, all of these learning styles are there. They actually are there naturally. Thanks for your question, Lawrence. Okay, thanks for your question, Leonie. As an adult, how do I figure out my learning style? Thank you. How do I know I'm retaining information in the most effective way? Fantastic question. Leonie, so think about when you studied for high school, even, or when you studied in university. If so, any time that you studied, how did you study? So, did you prefer to listen to your teacher and that's how you remembered the information? Did you need to take notes while you were in class? For example, I was taking notes all the time. I couldn't do anything else, just notes. And then I realized this is a visual learning style. But which style do you find is more comfortable? And that's the way you can tell what your learning style is. The best way to retain information would then be to build on that learning style and start exposing yourself to the information in different ways. Let's say you're learning a new language, you want to listen to that language, but you also need to use that language. You should write the language, read the language. So, all the learning styles would help you retain information in the best way. This would be the most effective way, really, of retaining information in the long run. What's nice about using the multiple learning styles is also you're helping your students retain information on a more permanent basis. So it's not just one time they've learned a word, now they move on and they never remember it again. You're helping them to remember this in the long run, which is really, really important. Okay, thank you very much, Leonie. Great question. Let's move on to another question from Monica. Welcome. I know breakout rooms can be done in Zoom. In what other systems? Great question. I know they can be done in Teams as well. Teams does breakout rooms. Um, and I would say before using a certain platform, just do research and see, does it allow you to do breakout rooms? Especially if you've got groups going on. You definitely want those breakout rooms to happen. Absolutely. So thanks for your question, Monica. Great. And we will just wait for a few other questions. Maybe if some come to mind, thinking about the different learning styles in your lessons. How do we incorporate them? Perhaps if anybody's had some experience with different learning styles in their lives or in their learning processes. Okay, got another question here. Do students worldwide mostly prefer Zoom or could Skype be used as well? Skype could be used as well, absolutely. In terms of group lessons, I think there might be an option to put them into breakout rooms, but please do check before. I would say, depending on the country. So, lots of, well, actually, you know what? Zoom and Teams would be equally popular nowadays. Zoom, you find a lot of the time is used for young learners, and Teams is used for more professional or adult students who are maybe more used to using that platform for work. Zoom is good, Skype is good. Google Video is another way that you could have online lessons. Um, Even WhatsApp, but it's not great because you want to be able to share your screen. So Zoom and Skype do allow you to share your screen as well as Teams. Okay, so thanks, Monica. There are no breakout rooms on Skype. So for group lessons, Skype wouldn't be the best. Sometimes the platforms change and they'll add breakout rooms or they'll take it away. So you've always, always, always got to check before going into your lessons. Okay, any other questions? Have a think. Anything else you'd like to ask about? The different learning styles? Thank you. We have a comment from Happy Dog English. I learned French old school, predating even early language labs. Wow, audiolingualism. I'd be excited to learn a language now with so many different learning styles applied in the classroom. Absolutely, absolutely. Old school learning a language, I think we've all learned probably in the course was more like lecture mode. It wasn't very active for the student, was more passive way of learning. Audiolingualism then came through, that's correct. It is very exciting to learn a language nowadays. It's very amazing in the sense that you are put into a very authentic situation. You're speaking the language in class. You're not allowed to use really your own language. It's not good for learning. And also the amount of different apps out there for learning languages. If you wanted to try, for example, things like Duolingo, I'm sure some of you have tried it. Is quite a nice way of learning, but of course, it shouldn't be the only way. It would just be a way to kind of include, um, and all many different other apps, or just speaking to people nowadays, watching Netflix. You're exposed to all these different languages, so we really can learn. Okay, nice. Thanks, Happy Dog English. It's nice as well if anybody can try, even get a demo lesson or ask a friend to try to teach you their language or their native language so you can get an idea of how your students feel when they're learning. It really is very interesting. Thank you so much, Catherine. I know I'm more of an auditory learner because things that I've been told stay in my memory longer than things I read. Aha. But I've also learned a lot of vocabulary from reading books, comics, and articles. Aha, there you go. So that shows that you do benefit from an auditory learning style, but also with a mix of visuals to confirm, for your brain to confirm that information. So again, a lot of us will find we don't have one learning style only. Our brain needs to confirm information as well. But very, very interesting. And another comment from Catherine. Thank you. It's a bit embarrassing to say, but I often practice my English by talking to myself. That's the best way. That's the best way. It's one of the best ways, Catherine. Why? Because what's happening is you are thinking in English. You are helping your brain to move to another system of thought in another language. I always tell my students to talk to themselves in English. If they don't have many people who want to practice, they must talk. On top of practicing with other people, I ask my students to talk to themselves and also to think in English 2, 3 minutes a day if they're beginners. This is very important. It's the dialogue in the brain. This is how you learn a language. This is how you acquire a language, actually. So that's great, Catherine. Keep doing that 100%. Okay, another comment from Leonie. Would it be a good idea to use Duolingo with our students? I don't think so, unless your school is affiliated with Duolingo. Don't use it as part of your lesson, but you could suggest students use it for self-study because it does help with a lot of drilling and grammar, drilling of grammar and vocabulary. But I would say rather use more real, tangible resources in the lessons. But Duolingo would be fine as self study, absolutely. And also, it should try to agree with your lesson plan and your goals. So keep in mind, Duolingo has its own curriculum. You need to make sure that fits in with what you're teaching as well. But again, Duolingo is great, but we need to incorporate all of the learning styles, which also includes speaking in a more authentic situation. Duolingo might ask you to maybe record your voice, which is fantastic. In the classroom, you get to have conversations. That's the difference. Okay. Thank you so much, Leonie. Let's look at another question. or rather a comment. Great comment. Thank you, Monica. We may have preference, but all these learning styles are useful to everyone. Exactly. And I think as teachers, we want to try and help our students not just learn a language, but also help them in their way of learning and create more variety in their way of learning, because that is more effective in the end. It's going to help them retain the information more. So, again, if we find that our student really loves reading and writing, we need to try and put a little bit of listening and speaking in there as well. Okay. Any other questions? Any other comments? Please feel free. It really is an interesting subject because we find out also how our brains process information. So, any other questions? Take your time, think about them. Any other questions? Feel free to post. Okay, so thanks, Lawrence. Question from you: how does the brain process information? Well, these are some of the ways. This is based on a lot of different theories. We're basing our knowledge on Gardner's theory, which tends to make a lot of sense and has also been studied. We process we process information, or at least the brain processes information through all these different means. So first we need to be introduced to a concept, and then, because our brain uses visuals and sounds, using new information with people, using new information alone, these are the ways that the brain processes that information and then, of course, retains that information. But there's always first a presentation of the new information, and then we're all different, so we'll all have our own ways of processing it. But yes, usually through visual means, audio means, kinesthetic means. This is how we process. Great question. Thank you, Lawrence. Okay, let's look at another question we have from Christine. Can I use translate apps in your lessons? I would suggest try not to use translation apps, because what that's doing is it's teaching your students basically to be reliant on something else that's not their brain when it comes to language. So you want your students at least to build their confidence levels up so that they can actually go into their brain and find that information on their own. This makes them also independent speakers. That's the first thing. The second is we want our students to think in the target language. When we translate two different languages word for word, chances are it's not going to be correct because languages work with different systems. The same goes for vocabulary. We have our false cognates. In one language, for example, in Spanish, let's say, the word for argue sounds like discuss in English. So these are different. So translation is never a good idea. You want the students to be able to use their brain first and foremost to find that information. And then, of course, to think in English. This is really, really important. So I would suggest also when you do start teaching, ask your students to think in English for a few minutes every day to get their brain used to this new system, basically. Thanks for your question, Christine. Let's move on to another question, Catherine. I remember that my sister always managed to learn better with background noise. Is this somehow related to learning styles? Background noise. I don't think it might be related to learning styles, but I think it's also about concentration. It's more about concentration. So I can certainly relate to your sister. I can really concentrate when there's background noise. It's more about that, more about focus. Great question, though. And let's move on to another question. Candice, how would one go about teaching your very first EFL class? How do you determine the level of English your students understand on day one? Okay, so Candice, this is a great question. And you can get more information on this from tutor support as well. But generally, I would always advise doing a needs analysis, taking time out of your first class also to get to know your students. You could create an activity, um, great activities for, let's say, from intermediate learners is choose 3 people you'd want to meet and why. Let them discuss that. It also gives you an idea about your students, what kinds of things they're interested in. But do a needs analysis first, and then you'll get an idea. That day one, generally, I like to use that as an introductory lesson to get to know your students a little bit. So you're taking out time to do that, and it's really important for learning. Okay, thank you, Candace. And we will take 2 more comments. Thanks, everyone. You've been so great today. Going back to Christine, can I use translating apps in a face to face classroom? I wouldn't suggest in a face to face or online. I would suggest trying to get your students to build independence in the language, not always having to rely on a translator. Even if your student doesn't know the specific word, ask them to describe the word. That way, they're using the language, you're eliciting the word. But if you think about it, translation apps do not help with eliciting. They give the information, and a lot of the time, that information can be forgotten because it's not being practiced or worked for, in a sense. So thanks, Christine. Let's go to our last comment. Thanks, Happy Dog English. Surely the danger of practicing by talking to yourself is that you could be practicing things wrong or inaccurately, thus ingraining incorrect information. How would you safeguard against that? Yes, good question. That's why I ask my students, especially at the lower levels, they don't need to go into a deep dialogue or self dialogue, but just to say a few things in their mind in English. For example, it's hot, I'm thirsty, I wonder what's for dinner. Nothing too intense, just a few sentences every day. And for speaking to yourself, it's true, there is the danger of fossilizing errors. But again, at the same time, it's still getting your brain to work in that language. So if those mistakes come out, that's why class would be important at that stage, but you would need to be aware. So, what you're saying, if you have any doubts about it, try to research it. You'll hear it in another context as well, depending on your level. So, again, beginners, not to have a full self dialogue, but for more advanced learners, it's still a good idea to do that. Okay, great. So, We are out of time, everyone, but it was so fabulous to see you all here and to see your names and all the beautiful countries that you are from. I hope you have the most amazing weekend. I hope you enjoy the course. And most importantly, I'm wishing you all the best in your TEFL career. It is a very, very exciting journey, and I'm very excited for all of you. So thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. And if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us on student or tutor support. Thanks, everyone. And also, just to remind you, I'm going to post our survey link. Tell us what you thought of the webinar. Thanks, everyone, and hope to see you soon. Bye.